As you look towards covering this next year, what are the biggest things you're concerned about as someone watching this from the outside now, but obviously wanting Joe Biden to succeed?
Buckle up. It's going to be a year. Love it or leave it.
Please welcome to the stage. She's a former White House press secretary. It's television's Jen Psaki. Hi. Oh, thanks for being here. I'm good. How are you? President Biden addressed the country last night on Israel and Ukraine. What are the goals of a national primetime address like that?
So let me first say, and we talked about this a little bit backstage, I've been at MSNBC for a little over a year now. This is the hardest story I've ever talked about, covered. Every single day that we did a show, we ended the show and we had this kind of gut check with our team and we said, did we do that right? Did we get that right? Did we talk about that? Were we sensitive in that moment? Did we share all the context? And I say that because I think a lot of people here probably know the history in the region, but also feel probably very deeply impacted by what happened. And it has been, I'm not going to cry right now, but I've cried on air multiple times over the last 2 weeks, and we embrace that. So let me start with that. But I would say primetime addresses, they are really fucking hard to do.
Yeah.
And they're hard to do for a couple of reasons. One is they're short. 12 to 15 minutes of a speech, it may not feel short when you're watching it. It is very, very short to write. And it is not a forum to give context of everything that's ever happened on that issue ever. That is especially hard when it talks. Imagine if you were to write this speech where it was, okay, Lovett, we need you to write a speech that's everything about Ukraine, the horrors of Putin, why they need money, also Israel, the Palestinians need money, Hamas is a terrorist group, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. You have 12 minutes. Actually make it 9 because Biden's going to add like 7 minutes. Go. That is what they were tasked with doing. So I say that because I think it was hard to weave all those things together, and I watched it and thought to myself, if I didn't know all the depth of all of these issues, this would be a little bit hard to follow. That's not necessarily a critique of it, it just would be hard to follow. But what I think he wanted out of that speech, and I don't know, we can maybe see a show of hands if people felt like they got this, was Hamas is very bad, Israel is reeling, this is their 9/11, the Palestinian people are not Hamas. They need help, they need assistance, they need aid. And by the way, anti-Semitism is horrible, Islamophobia is horrible. We should speak out against all of those things. You can't get a lot of, okay, some people got that. You don't, so that's what I think they wanted to accomplish. They also had to give a speech in part because when the president spends so much time on national security issues, people are wondering, what the heck are you doing? Why are you doing that? Why are you spending so much time talking about Israel? Why are you spending so much time talking about Ukraine? And I think they had to seize the moment to give a speech to kind of tell people why and also say, Congress, we need money. And I know you don't have a speaker, but we still need money.
One thing that I was sort of, to your point about how hard it is to thread all those needles, one part of it that I found sort of hard to parse is the speech, the portion about Ukraine seems to me is not aimed at the same people as the portion around Israel and Gaza, in the sense that right now the Ukraine debate is kind of a congressional debate. Obviously, I think that public opinion has sort of slowly started turning against U.S. support, U.S. involvement, but that's been a slow roiling change. Israel, Gaza, what is happening in the Middle East, that is on the front of every newspaper, the lead of every story. It's what the American people are talking about.
Well, it currently is. Now remember, Ukraine was on the front of every newspaper and on the front of and dominated television for the first couple of months. Actually, frankly, much longer than I thought it would. My mother-in-law, who's very smart, she's a retired teacher, but she was like mapping out war plans in Ukraine. Like she was giving me updates. And I mean, I was in the White House at the time because she consumed so much. That is true for what's happening in Israel right now. It is true for people's concern and horror about the humanitarian crisis that is currently happening in Gaza. It may not be the case in 3 weeks. And I think what the president thinks about, or what you have to think about when you're the president of the United States, is that this is not necessarily going to be on the front of newspapers, in the front of television every day, and people need money and assistance, and my job is to try to get that.
So we've seen a fair amount of polling that shows young people are more skeptical and maybe confused by America's alliance with Israel. They don't understand what our relationship is, why we provide military support, why we would want to be connected to what is reported certainly on the left as a sort of an unequivocal battle between people that have power and people that don't. How do you think about what President Biden should be doing? How should Democrats be talking about this issue when there are, I think, a lot of younger progressives that aren't sold on what the mainstream Democratic position is?
Yeah, this is a situation where there is decades, if not, of course, longer, of history, of occupation, of people who are, think about the people who have been asked to evacuate from Gaza. Many of them were already refugees there, right? They have been living under a blockade for decades. These are people who have been suffering for a long time. There's nowhere for them to go. It's not safe for them to go anywhere. There's no water, there's no energy, there's no power. You can talk about that simultaneously and the horror that people are fearing when they're in hospitals and they are barricaded in homes not knowing when they're going to be attacked, while also talking about the horrors of the Israeli people. And I'm not saying validating Prime Minister Netanyahu. By the way, Prime Minister Netanyahu is hugely unpopular, was long before this. Because, for people who are following this, because of the judicial reforms, which are absolutely outrageous, there's lots of parallels, by the way, to what would happen if Trump was reelected, so pay attention to that, in this country. Hugely unpopular. That does not take away from the pain that these people are feeling. And I will also say people who are members of the Jewish community in this country, I'm not Jewish myself, who have had grandparents who survived the Holocaust or great-grandparents, that is not something I have lived and experienced. But I also think that this is very visceral to people, and we can recognize that and honor that and value that while also honoring, talking about, and lifting up the horrors that are being experienced in Gaza right now. And part of that is not underestimating people's intelligence.
Yeah. Well, I also think from the other side of it, I do think that you see a lot of very pro-Israel and strident views that basically try to lump being critical of Israel with anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you also see a fair amount of anti-Semitism.
Yes.
And I do think that there's a challenge, I think, for those for like sort of everyone kind of in between those two poles to kind of articulate an argument for the right of Israel to exist, while at the same time that doesn't presume a lot of bad intentions on the part of everyone who has, from young people, specifically Jewish young people who protested at the Capitol, and a lot of people who have been brought into this issue primarily because of a concern for the Palestinians who deserve that concern.
Yes. I think sometimes people look, human nature, I'm the child of a therapist, so just like I do a lot of overanalysis of people, is like, it's very easy for any human being to categorize every other person they see, right? It's like, you are Jewish, therefore you must not care about the people in Gaza or the Palestinian people. That is not true. Or you are Jewish and therefore you support the actions of Prime Minister Netanyahu over the past. That is definitely not true. Just ask the Israeli people, or you are a Muslim American, therefore you don't recognize the horrors that were just experienced by the people in Israel. That is not true either. I think what we have, what has contributed to this, and this is not the only reason, is the rhetoric and the language and the hatred that we have seen from Donald Trump, from people who have followed him and who have echoed it and who have ignored it, and ignored it by, I mean, not speaking out against it. That has contributed to it as well, because it has allowed this forum for a lot of this hate speech in many directions to prosper.
Yeah, I also do think, like, I struggle with the fact that there is a whole apparatus on the right that will go and find the most heinous thing a person has said on a college campus, the most heinous thing a professor at a school somewhere in the country has said, and use that to kind of tar the entire left of this country, including the left that is vociferously advocating for the rights and dignity of Palestinians. I see that, and I see that as a means of trying to denigrate anybody that would care about the Palestinian people. But at the same time, I also worry about anti-Semitism, about the way in which there is obviously people who have legitimate criticisms of Israel, but at the same time, I think a lot of Jewish people have been surprised by just how much anti-Semitism they have seen. Sometimes, yes, elevated by the right, but sometimes just seeing it in their feeds, seeing it in their life. Now, part of that is the way social media puts the worst and most disgusting things in front of us, but I also do think this has called attention to a way in which I think a lot of people have turned a blind eye to certain quarters on the left, too.
Yeah, I think that is true. And, I think social media is a huge contributor to it, for sure. I also think should be a recognition, as you just mentioned. I mean, look, Jewish schools in New York, I don't know if anybody here is from New York. Welcome to Washington. Welcome to Washington. It's not as bad as the last game just made it sound. People need to, get out more. I don't even know. But Jewish schools in New York were kind of shut down, and some were closed down because of fear of people attacking. I'm talking schools with kids, right? That is absolutely horrible, crazy. I mean, I have a 5 and an 8-year-old. You think about some of these threats that people are under and feel and live viscerally every day, and that's a way that we should identify what's happening here. Forget about Prime Minister Netanyahu and this and that in Congress. That's important, but it's also about human beings and the impact on human beings. And I think when we come back to that, that should be very centering for all of us.
This debate also is not taking place in a vacuum. Neither is President Biden's response. Trump has been saying obviously bizarre and narcissistic things in response to this, saying that this wouldn't have happened if he were president, attacking Netanyahu, supporting Netanyahu, saying Hezbollah is smart. You've seen Republicans that are trying to vie for the nomination decide to scapegoat refugees and to make this about a bigoted view of around immigration. It seems like there's sort of two aspects of this. One is you have President Biden advocating for the importance of America's role in the world versus the isolationism sometimes you see on the right. And then you have President Biden as a force of kind of stability and adult leadership seriousness versus the kind of chaos and silliness that we see in the House and we see from the Republicans. How would you think about the foreign policy argument that will, of course, play a role in the upcoming election, even if it tends not to be the center of it?
I mean, I think that's a part of it. I mean, don't tell Tommy, but people don't vote on foreign policy typically. I love foreign policy too. I can nerd out with them totally, but we all can recognize that. But I think for President Biden, it's twofold. It is experience and preparedness for a crisis, which I think he has shown he is in this last couple of weeks, but also as it relates to Ukraine. The other piece of it, I mean, the biggest challenge, this is not a secret, although when you talk about his age, people whisper, and you're like, he's 81, he's tracking, guys, he knows. And it showed that he has the stamina. I mean, there's a reason why. I don't know if any of you saw the ad that they did with the Biden campaign did of him going to Ukraine. That wasn't because they think that people in the United States are voting on Ukraine. They're not. I mean, we care because we have bleeding hearts and it's important, but they use that because it's look at this guy. He took a train 11 hours. He's not old. Who can do that? And, his trip to Israel, coming back and doing this speech, I was really feeling for the people on Air Force One who were working and writing that speech. I was like, oh my God.
But also, and 60 Minutes, multiple speeches on the ground in Israel, a national address when he comes home.
Yes. That is hard to do, all of what he has done. You can like some of the things he said, not like it, feel like some things didn't strike the right curve. That's all fair, and that's a good, important debate. But what he's done over the last 2 weeks is exhausting, requires decades of experience to understand how to navigate it. There's a lot happening behind the scenes right now that people don't even see, they can't see. I mean, the 2 Americans who were released today, which is amazing, amazing news. That was because of hours, days, weeks of negotiations, talking to the Qataris. The fact that Rafah crossing in Egypt hopefully will open and get some humanitarian assistance through, that is because Tony Blinken just spent 10 days in the region sent by President Biden. The other thing, not to scare the crap out of people, and I'm sorry, but you played this clip of him talking about the warnings post 9/11. We'll see where this goes, but one of the scariest parts of what's happening over in the Middle East right now, I said I wasn't going to get nerdy, and I'm just like getting real nerdy here, is what's happening on the border with Hezbollah and Lebanon, in the border of Lebanon. And the fear here that you have if you're in the White House is the explosion of this war and a potential war with Iran. So what I heard from his warning on 9/11 and not following 9/11, which, by the way, I think he did a lot of what he needed to do in a very tricky way last night, but I actually thought the most important thing he said was what he said about 9/11.
Yeah, I agree.
Is because that is a warning. I mean, we were all, many people in this room, I was not just alive, I was out of college, I think. I don't know if maybe you were too. In that period when Congress, the media, everybody, maybe you weren't out of college, I don't know. All right, I'm a little bit older than you.
But
whatever.
But who cares?
I like your sneakers. But in that period, rush to war. There were mistakes made. There are people out there, where some of them are Republican candidates, who would love to attack Iran. So what I'm saying is, that could also be what this is about, right? What kind of leadership, how you see the role in the world, not rushing to war. War and military action is not a first resort, but a last resort.
So we're both former staffers. We're on liberal networks. Some people say we're, just like neo-lib shills. At the same time, I think you're someone, I've actually appreciated it, that you've been really trying to make sure that you are honest about what you think is going on in a way that is productive. You try to be, you're not taking sort of pot shots, but you're also being critical where you think it's necessary, being honest about how you view things. I often struggle with that. I think it's a hard thing to think about because obviously, as someone who is on television every day, if you were to go out and say something very critical about Joe Biden, it would get picked up on the right. People wouldn't notice it. But at the same time, there might be moments where you have a different point of view. You think it might be good for something to be changed.
This was leading up to the election last year. I said something like, if it's about Joe Biden, the Democrats will not win because it's a referendum on the presidency. And it was like the right wing was like, Jen Psaki admits that the president's terrible. I don't even know what it was, or something like that. But anyway, continue.
No,
this is where you're going.
But I do I do think it's how do you think about the moments where being honest is not just something you're doing to say vent an anxiety about Biden being old or to seem with it with the people that watch, right? But rather actually has a productive value. And when do you feel as though you are sort of holding back because you're trying to be a good member of the team, even if there's something, maybe you would want to be more critical of something, but you don't think it's particularly helpful?
I've thought a lot, and I'm sure you have too. I've thought a lot about when I left the White House, a lot of people asked me this question, and I thought, what's my bar? Because you don't meet this every day, or maybe you do, I don't know, who knows? You're younger than me, you're more agile.
All right.
Just kidding. Is what's my bar? And my bar is I don't want to erase my background because that would not be super useful. I mean, it is useful, I think, that I've done multiple presidential campaigns and worked at the State Department, stuff like that. I want to provide insight into what the thinking might be and actually say to people, that's not a big deal. Stop freaking out about that, or this is actually a big deal over here. At the same time, I don't want to be overly, if I went out every day and said, Joe Biden is the greatest president who has ever walked the earth and he's never made a mistake, that's not very authentic, it's not very credible because everybody makes mistakes. Or if I went out every day, and some people do this, and just decided to find random things to trash him about, that's not authentic either. So that's kind of my bar and how I try to think about it. But what I think about is where can I actually provide some insight into what's going on, right? It's been, I think, an adjustment for people not to be what's the president thinking about this? I'm I haven't worked there in like 16 months. I mean, I can tell you, like, give you a broad sense, but I do think about that a lot and really try to check myself and make sure it's like I'm providing insight into how the White House works, how the State Department works, how thinking around trips or speeches work, but not being kind of a cheerleader or like the opposite of that, right?
Yeah.
Because I don't think that's my job.
Yeah. As you look towards covering this next year, what are you thinking about in terms of like, what are the biggest things you're concerned about as someone watching this from the outside now, but obviously wanting Joe Biden to succeed?
Buckle up. It's going to be a year. Look, I think one of the things I always remind myself of, and I feel like maybe we'll talk about this at the end of, if there's a game of sorts, I don't know, is that we're a year out from the election. And any headline that is telling you this speech will determine the outcome, first of all, it drives me insane. Burn that stuff in a fire. It is crazy. No one knows. No one knows. There could be far worse things or far better things. And it's I mean, on the Obama campaign, we were like talking about his opposition to the Iraq War and how he was, the change you can believe in. And then there was a financial crisis 6 weeks before the election. That's what determined the outcome. What I'm worried about, I'm worried about voter suppression and laws that are passing in states across the country that people may not be paying enough attention to. I'm worried about enthusiasm, although I do think that will change once people see what the stakes are, but I don't think that should be underestimated. I don't think they are underestimating it, but that I'm worried about. I'm worried about a war with Iran. I'm worried about I'm worried about lots of things, aren't you guys? But here's the thing: everybody needs to be very worried. I'm not a believer that everybody should just sit and settle in.
Yeah.
Be worried.
Be worried.
Be worried.
Be worried.
Yeah. Be freaked out and stressed, please. It's horrible, everybody.
Yeah. Joyful and terrified.
Yeah.
That is our energy. And on that note, Jen is going to stick around, but we'll be right back.